Yo, welcome to Chapter 10, AMSCO U.S. History, The Age of Jackson from 1824 to 1844. If you haven't yet, please make sure to subscribe so we can get that subscriber count up. Thanks so much. This era, known as the Age of Jackson or the Age of the Common Man, or even the era of Jacksonian democracy, was really revolutionary for America because it was the first time mass numbers of people were allowed to vote, unlike the aristocracy from before. So the first thing that came up was the election of 1824. So in the election of 1824, the Democratic Republicans had four candidates trying to succeed the presidency. So they were John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State, Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, William Crawford, who was a prominent figure in the U.S. Congress, and Andrew Jackson, a war hero from many wars before. And so between these four people, Andrew Jackson won the majority. He got the most popular votes, also the most electoral votes. So technically he should be president, right? Well, no, what happened was he didn't reach the majority, and so a runoff had to be occurred with the vote being decided by the House of Representatives. So the fourth place person, according to the Constitution, gets kicked out. So Clay came in last, so he got kicked out. And so it was really just Crawford, Adams, and Jackson. Well, Crawford had a stroke, so he had to bail out as well. So it was just Adams versus Jackson. And so John Quincy Adams sort of colluded with Henry Clay, and Clay used his influence as Speaker of the House to swing the vote in favor of Adams, who didn't even win the popular and electoral vote. As a result, John Quincy Adams became president and immediately appointed Clay his Secretary of State, which was like the stepping stone to the presidency at this time. So Jackson and his followers cried foul, and they called this the corrupt bargain because it seemed like the rules were being broken. These political maneuvers were not popular among Jackson's people. So the next thing we have is the nullification crisis. So eventually, 4 years later, Adams didn't really do much, and he established these new tariff laws in 1828 along with Congress, which generally helped the northern manufacturers and protected their manufacturing industry, but alienated the southern planters. And southerners really hated it. They called it the tariff of abominations. So the southerners they got together, and they were really going to try to put Jackson into office for real this time. So once he got into office, though, there were problems, and one of them was the nullification crisis. So basically what happened was Jackson favored states' rights, but not disunion. And in 1828, the South Carolina legislature wanted to get rid of the increased tariff because, of course, it didn't help their planter base. And also his first vice president, John C. Calhoun, was also for this, but he really wanted to keep the Union together. And so South Carolina decided to nullify this in the nullification crisis. Basically, they decided that this federal law was void and they did not want it to take effect. Well, then there was huge debates in Congress between like Daniel Webster of Massachusetts and Robert Hayne of South Carolina. And eventually what had happened was Jackson got his way, and he helped modify the tariff along with South Carolina. But Calhoun really didn't like it, and he hated this new tariff of 1832 that had happened. And even though Congress lowered the tariff, it was still fairly unpopular. But the biggest thing that came out of this was states started to nullify rights, and this was sort of fracking the federal government. Another event that occurred during the Jackson presidency was the Indian Removal Act. So the Indian Removal Act was in the year 1830, and basically what happened was Jackson signed this bill into law, and it basically called for the removal of a lot of Native American groups. So his concept of democracy did not include Native Americans in it. So he wanted to sympathize with the land-hungry citizens that had elected him and force the resettlement of thousands of American Indians. Most commonly, these were, well, they're not here, but they were the Cherokee of Central Georgia and North Georgia, the Creek of like Alabama, and the Choctaw and Chickasaw of Mississippi. So he signed this Indian Removal Act, and by 1835, there was even a Bureau of Indian Affairs that relocated these eastern tribes all the way west into modern-day Oklahoma territory. So this proved out to be popular at the time, but as we see it now, it was really bad. This would also give way to the Trail of Tears that actually happened after Jackson's presidency, in which Cherokees were forced to march west, and a quarter of them died in the process. Another one was Worcester versus Georgia, still on the topic of the Cherokee. So Worcester was this missionary who sort of lived with the Cherokee, and he violated the Georgia statute at the time that non-Native Americans cannot be present on these Native American lands. Well, the court thought this was bogus, and so the High Court ruled that the laws of Georgia had no force within Cherokee territory, effectively showing that the Cherokee was a sovereign nation and that they had equal rights. Well, then here came Jackson with the famous quote that he has made his decision, now let him enforce it. He was basically talking about John Marshall, who said that although the Cherokee were sovereign, because he wasn't the executive branch, he couldn't actually enforce this rule. So as a result, Worcester versus Georgia gave the Cherokees more power, but it still didn't prevent their removal in the 1830s. Around the time of Jackson, there was also the institution of the two-party system. Basically, there had been a one-party system, only with the Democratic Republicans, in the era of good feelings, but eventually it gave way to a two-party system. The Democratic Republicans broke into the Democrats, while sort of the Republicans and his rivals broke into a new party called the Whigs. So Jackson led the Democrats, and Henry Clay led the Whig Party. So this new Whig Party really started to challenge Jackson and some of his crazy agenda ideas. So the Democratic Party really sort of resembled like Jefferson's Republican Party, so to speak, and the Whig Party sort of wanted more big government. So they were kind of like the Federalist Party of Hamilton. Eventually, Democrats and Whigs would really have to respond to this relentless westward expansion of America and this new industrialization and this new economy. So one big federal issue was the rechartering of the Bank of the United States. So the second bank had been rechartered by many years before by Madison, and this new bank, although privately owned, received federal deposits, and so it had this public purpose of cushioning the national economy. And the bank's president, Nicholas Biddle, seen right here, was really running fairly smoothly, and it was kind of good for America. However, Jackson did not really like Biddle because he was a big supporter of Henry Clay. And so Henry Clay really was supported by Biddle, and so he tried to push through this bill, and it succeeded in Congress to pass a bank recharter bill. Well, Jackson promptly vetoed it, one of his 12 vetoes in office, and called it private monopoly that enriched the wealthy and foreigners at the expense of the common people and a quote-unquote hydra of corruption. Sort of like this political cartoon scene right here. And basically, the voters backed Jackson, and he beat Clay in the election of 1832. This really sort of just destroyed the bank and will lead to problems later on. And this is the second bank seen right here, and it was actually in Philadelphia at this time. Given this, there was not another recharter for the National Bank for another 20 years. There was also the Specie Circular, and this was basically also related to money. So basically, Jackson's financial policies and feverish speculation in Western lands, because prices for land was kind of cheap out there in the West because there was a lot of it, made goods really badly inflated. And so Jackson tried to control this near the end of his presidency by ordering the Specie Circular. It basically said that all future purchases of federal lands out west had to be made in specie, so gold, silver, rather than the paper banknotes. Well, this kind of made like a panic because people thought that banknotes weren't really worth anything, and banknotes lost their value and land sales plummeted. And right after this, there was this really bad panic of 1837, and it put America into a depression. John C. Calhoun, we talked a bit about earlier. Basically, he was the first vice president in Jackson's first term, and he really was from South Carolina, and he was really just fervent states' rights supporter. So he wasn't all that for the big economy. You may remember him for the nullification crisis. And after he was fired from the vice presidency, he became a senator in the Senate for South Carolina, and he really just opposed the president on many issues. So Calhoun and Jackson really had a bunch of bitter battles stemming all the way back from when Calhoun was a Secretary of War and Jackson was a general, and Jackson didn't listen to Calhoun and absolutely destroyed the natives and some British in Florida. You may remember that. So Calhoun really goes back and traces roots with Jackson all the way back to Monroe when he was the Secretary of War. So the next person is Martin Van Buren. So Van Buren was this master of practical politics, and after the two terms of Jackson, there was this election of 1836, and the his party, the Democrats, nominated Van Buren, who was also the second-term vice president for Jackson. And so Van Buren was a lot like Jackson. He had the same laissez-faire economics, and it really was bad for the economy because, as you may remember, when Jackson left, there was already a financial depression. And so if Buren continued this policy, it really didn't help America's cause, and America still suffered some more. So 4 years later, he sort of ran into troubles. Panic of 1837, we sort of talked earlier, caused by Jackson and the specie circular, and basically banknotes becoming devalued. There was also the Seminole Wars, so these had many different things, but basically the Seminoles were this tribe in Central Florida in the Everglades, and they really were sort of just running wild because Spain didn't really control them, and America didn't own Florida at the time. So you may remember one of his earliest days were battling the Seminoles when he was a military general, and so those were a few of the Seminole Wars. But also during the Indian Removal Act, the Seminoles battled again because they really didn't want to leave their homeland in Florida, but it didn't really work, and they got relocated to Oklahoma as well. So these were just a few of the many Seminole Wars of the Seminole tribe in Florida. So as said earlier, Van Buren sort of continued the politics of Jackson, and it didn't work because the country was in a depression. So the Whigs finally got their act together and organized a popular war hero, William Henry Harrison, who you may remember battling just like Jackson out in the western frontier, sort of in the Ohio River Valley. And basically they said this war hero, nicknamed Tippecanoe because he fought a battle called the Battle of Tippecanoe, they sort of labeled him sort of as a person of the people as well. So they pointed to his humble origins. For example, he was born in a log cabin, so they put log cabins on wheels. And they also passed out hard cider for voters. These were really sort of like the first big political rallies in American histories. And they also had John Tyler, who was his vice president. So there was this big sort of slogan called Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So that was sort of the Whigs' first offensive of the time. And they also attacked Martin Van Buren, called him Martin Van Ruin, and also said he was like an aristocrat with a taste for foreign wine. So a lot of mudslinging in this campaign as well. But ultimately, the people decided that they really did not like the policies and economics and the depression of the time. So as a result, the Whigs won, and they became the new national party and ruling. However, you may remember that Harrison didn't wear too much on Inauguration Day and delivered the longest speech in presidential history for an inauguration, and he died less than a month later. It was like 14 days later of pneumonia, and so he was also like the shortest president. So of course the vice president has to take the lead, and President Tyler, who was not much of a Whig, took this new presidency. But he wasn't really a Whig, so he was more like a Democrat. He favored Southern and expansion Democrats. And with this, the Jacksonian era was sort of in its last stage, and after Tyler and such, things started to shift with the Mexican War and the issue of slavery, which eventually would lead to the Civil War. So this has been the Age of Jackson from 1824 to 1844. Thanks so much for watching, and join me next time as we continue in the story of America.